Welcome back, Bad Things family. At the time of this recording, it's 2021. And despite our many disagreements, we can all agree on one thing right now. A lot can happen in a year. And in the early 20th century, an entire world could change in just a decade. The 1920s began with the promise of escalating violence. During 1921, it was delivered in abundance, as famine, riots, and political upheaval circled the globe. Today we're going to cover a few of the worst and least remembered events from that year. Let's begin with a British submarine disaster. HMS K5. K5 was a British submarine that was first brought into service during 1916. It was part of a group of submarines called the K class. They used steam-powered engines to move and were mostly designed to operate in the North Sea. The submariners that had to travel in these vehicles called them the Calamity class because of how prone they were to accidents. In total, 18 were built. 6 would be lost because of accidents. On January 19, 1921, K5 left with the rest of the Atlantic Fleet to participate in a mock battle. There were 51 people on board as it embarked upon this training exercise. The fleet received a signal that K5 was diving, then it slipped beneath the surface. It was never heard from again. When the fleet began searching for the submarine, all they found were oil slicks and some debris. It was believed that it dived below its maximum allowed depth and was crushed. Opinions after the disaster were that the K-class submarines should never have been taken to the Atlantic Ocean during winter. They were not designed for that type of operation. A rear admiral wrote of the event, "It may be taken as certain that the loss of the vessel was due to some delay to checking the downward momentum gained by the vessel being over-trimmed in diving, either by admitting compressed air too slowly, to too many tanks at one time, to tanks only partially full, or to a sea connection being closed prematurely." The British Navy began scrapping and selling K-class submarines at the end of 1921. Group Settlement Scheme. Australia began implementing the White Australia policy in 1901. It was a series of laws that served a single purpose. The government wanted to increase numbers of white settlers on the continent while restricting immigration from countries whose residents were not white. In addition to racial purity, the government had another problem. They were dependent on food imports from other countries. That was a problem that needed to be fixed. Western Australia was a rugged environment, but the government thought it might be a good idea to let families move there and begin farming. It would help reduce dependence on foreign trade. At first, land was only offered to former soldiers. In 1921, that was expanded to civilians. The Australian government then offered to import white people from the UK. Thanks to World War I, the UK was having serious financial problems. So they were happy to send unemployed men and their families to the other side of the world. The UK and Australia agreed that over a 5-year period, 6,000 families would travel to Western Australia and settle there. Some of the applicants who arrived immediately went back home. The situation was harsher than advertised. Those who remained found life to be extremely difficult. Most of the settlers had no farming experience, they were given inadequate equipment for the job, and much of the land was unable to support crops. After several lean years, at least half of the residents fled. Those that remained simply couldn't afford to leave. The government made sustenance payments to the remaining residents for several years. After World War II, another immigration scheme finally succeeded in making the farms productive. There is a flourishing dairy industry in the area today. Burning of the Custom House. The Irish War of Independence began in 1919. The escalation of violence would reach its peak in 1921. The Custom House in Dublin, Ireland was the home of several government agencies. This included British agencies that helped administer Ireland. The Irish Republican Army decided that it should attack this building and inflict as much damage upon the British as possible. Early on the afternoon of May 21st, 120 IRA volunteers gathered around the custom house. They were in groups of 2s and 3s and were not wearing any uniforms. Most of the soldiers were inexperienced. Also, the men were armed only with pistols and a small amount of ammunition. At 1 p.m., the IRA volunteers rushed the building and overpowered the guards. Then they took cotton soaked with gasoline and began distributing it throughout the building. Finally, they set it on fire and the custom house began burning. At 1:10 p.m., a nearby policeman notified British forces. The IRA did not realize this and were surprised when vehicles full of British soldiers arrived. A gunfight erupted, but after 30 minutes, the IRA soldiers were out of ammunition. In the end, 111 people were arrested. The custom house was destroyed, but has since been rebuilt. Irish government records going back to the 1600s were stored there. They were all lost in the fire. R38 Crash. Germany began developing rigid airships in the early 1900s. By the end of World War I, both the UK and the United States were building them too. An airship consisted of a frame that was surrounded by some type of fabric. Then it would be filled with hydrogen gas. The gas allowed the airship to float through the atmosphere. It was also very flammable. After World War I ended, the UK sold many of its airships to the United States. This included one airship called R38. Prior to final delivery, it had to be tested. During the first 2 test flights, problems were found with the control surfaces. Those were fixed, but on the 3rd flight, the vehicle began shaking violently at high speed. The crew working on the airship expressed serious doubts about the design, but they were told to continue trying to fix the problems. On August 23rd, a crew of 49 took R-38 on its final test flight over the city of Hull. They climbed to 2,500 feet and began a series of turns. Thousands of spectators watched as the frame of the airship began to buckle. It split into 2 pieces, and then the hydrogen exploded. Men and equipment fell from the ruptured airship to their deaths. The concussion wave from the explosion broke windows all over the city. 44 of the R-38 crew died in the crash. This single tragedy was not enough to stop progress. Airship development continued until the 1930s. Oppau Explosion. The BASF plant in what is today Ludwigshafen, Germany, used to make fertilizer. It made ammonium sulfate fertilizer until 1911. Supply lines were interrupted during World War I and Germany could no longer acquire sulfur. A new chemical process was used to work around this problem. This new process made ammonium nitrate. It was stored in the same place as the ammonium sulfate. The 2 substances mixed and compacted into a form that closely resembled concrete. Workers had to use pickaxes to extract the fertilizer. But they couldn't just walk in and start hitting the mixture with an axe. They might be buried in fertilizer if the pile collapsed. So first, they would use dynamite to break it into smaller pieces. Engineers knew that ammonium nitrate was highly explosive, but when mixed with ammonium sulfate, they thought the risk was low. So using dynamite was acceptable. And it worked for the first 20,000 times they tried it. Nobody is sure exactly what went wrong, because everybody died. On September 21st at 7:32 a.m. there was a huge explosion. A moment later, there was a second explosion. The damage to the nearby city was so immense that nearly 80% of all buildings were destroyed. Over 560 people were killed. Honorable mentions. There are many more horrible events from 1921 that we won't be able to cover today, but we wanted to mention them briefly. First, the Tulsa Race Massacre took place on May 31st and June 1st. In perhaps the worst instance of racial violence in U.S. history, and that's saying something, a mob of white citizens attacked black residents, destroying their businesses and homes. The reason we did not cover this event is because a lot of documentaries have been made on the topic recently. Now we can't add anything to what is already out there. The next unpleasant event was the Russian famine of 1921. For a variety of completely preventable reasons, Russia experienced extreme food shortages. Millions died, and before it was over, the residents began eating each other. We have a full episode devoted to this topic if you want to learn more about it. Finally, the Battle of Blair Mountain took place in West Virginia. When coal miners tried to form a union, the government and business owners responded with violence. The result was the largest armed uprising in the United States since the Civil War. We have a full episode on this as well. For those who lived through this turbulent decade, the future seemed uncertain and violence all too likely. Even as they hoped for a better future, the bitter failures of humanity infected their most valiant efforts. But we're still here, so apparently the people who survived the 1920s did something right. What do you think about the events we covered today? Give us your opinion in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, hit the like button, consider subscribing to our channel if you want to become progressively more disappointed in humanity, and we also have a Patreon page if you are interested in signing up. Now, our parents always told us we would grow up to be a bunch of beggars. Well, at least we don't have to be failures. Thank you for watching Bad Things in History.